Hey squad, so it has been a while since I was able to progress through some of the chapters in the Silmarillion as part of my project to read through as much Tolkien as I can, chapter by chapter, with commentary. And while I admit that that is my fault, I also maintain that I have an explanation, and that explanation is I got sidetracked. In true Tolkienian fashion, I fell victim to my own hubris. I got overly ambitious. I soon found myself in over my head and bogged down by trivia. My own proposed goals overwhelmed me, and I stalled. Now, however, I have worked my way out more or less of the hole I was in, and I'm ready to continue on. But before I do that, I am first going to inflict upon you, my helpless listeners, what I learned during my little ill-fated shortcut. So to backtrack a little bit, the intent behind the Tolkien read-along project was, first of all, I thought it would be something useful or interesting or at the very least entertaining for other people. The concept itself is maybe not the most original one, but it's kind of a popular one, and I feel like that's probably for a reason. And after I finished going through all the chapters or sections in a given work or volume, the result would be a sort of complete companion to whatever book it happens to be. So the sum of the whole would be almost greater than the sum of the parts, which was another facet that I thought would make it appealing or potentially valuable to other people. But the other motivation behind it was I thought that this would be a good chance for me to approach the material with greater depth of attention and more of a sort of scholarly or formal frame of mind. Of course, the first time I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion, I read them more or less completely straight through. But the way I tend to reread books that I really like is to sort of pick through them as my mood dictates. So while I've probably reread the text in all of those books several times by this point, I don't think I've actually read any of those three pieces from start to finish in a single sort of sitting or session in probably at least 5 years. For over a decade, I was pretty much just reading them for pleasure, dipping in and out of them as I saw fit, looking things up as they caught my interest, but really mostly motivated by my own whim at the moment, and not looking to systematically trace any particular themes or organize the information using any specific framework. And increasingly, I think that's the kind of approach I need to bring to kind of evolve my own understanding and ideas. So when it was decided that we were going to start by going through the Silmarillion, as dictated by the results of an early Patreon poll, I thought to myself, hey, I'm probably not going to do this kind of thing very often. Start at page 1 and go all the way through to page 300 or whatever. So since I'm here and since I'm doing this, wouldn't it be a great idea to try to work in at the same time any particularly relevant material from, for example, Histories of Middle-earth about the evolution of a particular chapter or account or narrative, or some of the alternate concepts that were either abandoned or weren't complete enough to sort of mesh with the rest of the published text, or the ideas that got left out. And I started to base my approach off of that idea. Now, I was here going off of the vague notion I had that the 12-volume series, The Histories of Middle-earth, was kind of laid out chronologically, but unlike the published standalone narratives, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and Silmarillion, Histories of Middle-earth was not something that I had ever sat down and read cover to cover, and if you're acquainted with some of the volumes of Histories of Middle-earth, you'll probably see why. Now, I would say that I have read and reread the majority of the material in Histories of Middle-earth, particularly some of those sections that are the most complete or the most influential or that contain the richest sort of additional narrative detail. But I acquired the books out of order, and again, I read them primarily for pleasure, and I would only really pay attention to the parts that I thought were interesting or cool from moment to moment. Now, doing this over a period of 10 or 15 years, I eventually cemented a good portion of the details of the material itself, and I got a sort of vague, comprehensive overview of how the series was organized and how it functioned. But again, this was very informal, very idiosyncratic. And it left me with this idea that turned out to be much tidier than the reality. Because as complicated as the history of the actual writing of what we now call the Silmarillion is, the history and organization of the histories of Middle-earth is quite complex in its own right. And unfortunately complex in such a way that does not lend itself particularly well to my original idea, which was to sort of sketch out in very broad strokes how each narrative chunk of the published book we call the Silmarillion came to be what it is. And it turns out that even allowing for how chaotic Tolkien's creative process tended to be and the editorial difficulties that have kind of become a meme at this point in their own right, it is still a lot trickier to do that than I anticipated.
But that doesn't mean I'm not going to try. So, to really understand the nature of the undertaking, we have to revisit the story of how all of this material came to be published and accessible. It's a pretty well-known story at this point, I think, how after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, it seemed like there was finally enough public interest that the publication of the Silmarillion could be justified. And of course, the Silmarillion and the more sort of mythic material and legends from the First Age had been Tolkien's life work at this point. It was the project closest to his heart, the one that really appealed to his imagination. And so for nearly 20 years after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, he would work on and off at trying to organize and revise and rewrite the considerable volume of sometimes very complex material that he had generated over the course of the past 50 or so years. He died with that work still unfinished. His literary executor was his youngest son, Christopher Tolkien. And since what the public and the publishers were clamoring for was this sort of mythic, complete volume titled The Silmarillion that contained the full account of the backstory that was so often referenced in The Lord of the Rings but never really fully elaborated on, that was the first thing that Christopher kind of tried to deliver. To get everything to cohere nicely in one relatively readable linear narrative. Of course, he had to leave out a lot of really well-developed and useful extra material, as well as a lot of non-narrative material like essays that were relevant to understanding the Third Age and the Lord of the Rings. So he selected some of the most complete and most relevant of, generally speaking, the post-Lord of the Rings writings, and published those in a single volume called Unfinished Tales. Almost a companion piece, or even one could say an appendix, to the Silmarillion. Or another way that he puts it is, for people who are mostly interested in the created world as an object of contemplation in its own right. He says that's totally valid, but there's another mode of investigation that's more concerned with the literary development of different themes and drafts over time. And he even notes that in the wake of the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales, he was seeing a lot of commentary by scholars that seemed to him to be a misrepresentation of what the Silmarillion was and wasn't. These misaimed conclusions that were being drawn in part because people just didn't have the full story and the full context. So that's what he's attempting to lay out in History of Middle-earth. And early on in this undertaking, he says the books will be more like a series of editions. So that's a kind of general framework for understanding the goal of the 12-volume series. But of course, we find that the reality is much more complicated than that, and increasingly complicated as the series progresses. And none of this, by the way, is meant as criticism or disparagement of Christopher Tolkien, who had a horrifically difficult job in even attempting to compile this material, much less do so in a way that was accurate and organized and useful, and in many cases even just readable. And pretty much at every turn, he's quite clear and upfront with his audience that he knows the results aren't going to be perfect. If you go to Tolkien Gateway, which since it's a wiki, I consider it a sort of good starting point as a common denominator for what the collective wisdom and understanding of the fandom as a whole is.
You get this overview and summary of the contents of History of Middle-earth. So it says the first 2 books introduce us to the Book of Lost Tales, the first conception of Tolkien's legendarium. The 3rd volume deals with long poems concerning some of the main stories. The following 2 books, so 4 and 5, follow developments from the Book of Lost Tales to the first so-called Quinta Silmarillion. 6 through 9 discuss the development of The Lord of the Rings, while the second half of Book 9 discusses the Tale of Numenor. Books 10 and 11 discuss the later developments of the Silmarillion, which served as source material for the published edition, and the final book entails the development of the Lord of the Rings appendices, followed by some assorted essays that were written in the last years of Tolkien's life. Again, it's not that that's wrong or inaccurate, it's just that it's a drastically simplified version of the horrible, writhing, complex reality. So, among the kinds of issues that are not even hinted at in that overview are just how disorganized a state the material was left in upon Tolkien's death, and how much difficulty there is in even just ordering things chronologically by date written. So it's very rare that Tolkien would bother to date things, which again, I mean, it's his rough drafts, his private writings, just trying to get something out on paper. So it's not like we can really blame him for that. He also moved house several times, which anyone who's moved even once knows how mixed up and mixed together things can get, and if he's done that several times in a 20 or 30-year span, it makes things rather difficult. So often, Christopher is determining the order here based on criteria like what form of a word or name Tolkien is using in a given text. Complicated, of course, by the fact that sometimes Tolkien changed his mind and reverted back to an earlier form of a name, sometimes like halfway through writing a paragraph. Another method that I find really funny is that a lot of times Tolkien is writing on the backs of scrap paper. There were actual paper shortages going on that meant he kind of had to use what was available for his drafting. So, for example, there's one batch of essays that are written on the back of scrap paper sent to him by his publishers. They had kind of extras. And these scrap papers have material on them that has the date of 1967, so you know that it had to have been written at least after 67, although that doesn't mean that it couldn't have been written later than 67, and indeed a lot of it was. There's some documents that we can work out must have been written or at least typed up at around the same time because he says one of the typewriters that was used had a very distinctive typeface. So essentially they're all in the same weird font. And as ingenious as all of these methods are, they can't really give us a perfectly clear picture of the composition history. And so as a result, as you're reading through each volume of the History of Middle-earth, you will see the estimates of what order these things might have been written in change from volume to volume as more material gets put into place and sometimes literally uncovered. Like, oh, we thought that this was lost, but then we found it in a box. Clearly it should have belonged in volume 5, but I've only just found it now halfway through writing volume 9. And on top of this, there's the consideration that some manuscripts and drafts and materials are no longer directly in Christopher's possession when he's compiling these volumes. Some of the stuff has been archived in different places or is owned by other companies or collectors. So that's obviously another wrinkle. In addition to the problems with dating and the problems with just physically getting your hands on all of the necessary and relevant material, there's also the problem of Tolkien's workflow, which does not really proceed steadily from year to year at a constant or regular rate, moving sequentially from one idea to the next. It was really more like lightning bolts of creativity, these little moments in time of great energy that would branch out in multiple different directions. And then there would be a pause. Now, this causes issues when you try to take all the material generated in that fashion and break it up into sort of logically organized volumes that are all more or less the same length. So I'll get into some more specific examples of that later. But the material results of that kind of workflow also just affect raw legibility. So a lot of times a particular story, and this is a pastiche. This isn't meant to be an accurate account of any one particular narrative, but Christopher Tolkien will describe a process something like, well, He wrote Manuscript A probably sometime before 1920, and then he would write his revisions over the top of that, and that would give us Manuscript B. We don't know when he was doing that. It was probably over the course of many years, but we know that in 1932, he typed up a version that was almost word for word the same as Manuscript B, so we're assuming that B and Typescript C are the same. And then in the margins of the typescript, he wrote revisions that we could call version D, except that it also includes stuff that originally appeared in the first Manuscript A that he had changed and left out, but now he's changing his mind again and bringing back in. Then he lost the paper for 10 years, and some point during that decade, he wrote 4 chapters of the same story in a totally unrelated style that we can call Manuscript Alpha. And then, while on holiday, he found version D again, revised it based on the new material in Alpha, typed up the latest version that we have, and that's the version that I've presented here, except, oh yes, in the last 5 pages, he switched to writing in Anglo-Saxon every other paragraph, so I've provided a rough translation in the notes. Like, that, I think, is a decent representation of the kind of complexities that arise in trying to trace the evolution just of a given story, much less how it related to all the other stories that he would have been working on in those time periods. And one detail that's kind of been sticking out to me the past couple days is the man was very thrifty with his paper. And I wonder the degree to which that habit of reuse contributed to that, what now seems to us a very unique and idiosyncratic style of composition and revision, where you're writing layers of revision literally over the top of the previous version in different colors of ink. You know, maybe if Tolkien in 1917 had magically been given access to a word processor, things might now be much different. So these are some of the conditions and trends that explain why the organization of History of Middle-earth and related texts sort of has to be as complicated as it is. Another issue that has to be grappled with, both in preparing this material for publication and then by the reader in the course of making inquiries like the one I propose to make, is deciding what actually counts as the Silmarillion. This is another one that seems deceptively simple. I think most people, speaking casually or informally, tend to use the term Silmarillion to refer to the backstory conceived as a whole, maybe with the vague understanding that, say, there was a, cutoff point in the late 20s, and before that, he'd been working on related material that was sort of a proto-Silmarillion, but not quite the thing itself. And also maybe the understanding that there are certain essays or linguistic texts or poems, expansions, digressions, deleted scenes that involves the same subject matter as, quote, the Silmarillion, but wasn't intended to be part of the Silmarillion, so-called. You could almost conceive of them as auxiliary texts in a way. Or, again, appendices, to use another word that, for me at least, now has permanent, indelible Middle-earth connotations. This is, of course, another topic that Christopher Tolkien wrestled with, how to present the Silmarillion, what to include in it, and then how to handle not only the overlapping versions of the Silmarillion proper, but also what to do with the often very developed texts that, for one reason or another, could not be included in the version of the Silmarillion that seemed to him to be the most viable one to produce. And by that I mean a single volume of contained narrative, uninterrupted and with minimal sort of editorial commentary or context. We've already noticed that the published Silmarillion actually contains a range of texts, the Quenta Silmarillion being the main and central one, but it also, of course, has the Ainulindale and the Valaquenta, and we've talked about how those emerged as separate from the main narrative in a way, and what some of the implications of that might be. And then after that, there's the Akalabeth and the account of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. And then within the Quenta Silmarillion, as published, each of the so-called 3 great tales, Beren and Luthien, the Children of Húrin, and the Fall of Gondolin, are all included. They're all pretty central to the narrative, so you can't really leave them out. But they each get about a chapter apiece, and for all of them, There exist various, typically incomplete but much more developed versions in both prose and verse. And even leaving aside the fact that those versions are typically not in a form that would mesh well with the rest of the Silmarillion, either again because they're unfinished, or because they're told in verse, or because the most complete version of them is the one from Book of Lost Tales, where everyone has different names, and the geography and the genealogies are all totally different, so it's difficult to import that into the latest and most coherent version of the history of the First Age. But also just because it's sort of an issue of balance. Christopher notes that the book is already pretty uneven in tone and pacing. If you did try to include expanded versions of the three great tales in the Silmarillion, you'd essentially be inserting an almost novella-length narrative into the middle of this other thing that's supposed to be a more or less coherent whole that can stand on its own. This thing we call the Silmarillion. So then what should we consider things like, take an easy example, the Children of Húrin, which of the three is the one that is the closest to a final, finished, more or less complete form? Do you consider that a part of the Silmarillion? Or is it better to conceive of the Great Tales as being separate? Even though, again, they're crucial parts of the history, so of course there's going to be a lot of overlap and interconnection between the two. And then if we take a slightly more complicated example, what about the Lay of Leithian, which is the poetic telling of a good, I would say at least half, maybe even 2/3 in places of the Beren and Luthien saga, and also ends up being very important to the broader Silmarillion, because it's where we see big changes to characters like Finrod and Celegorm, and heck, I mean even Sauron, which end up shaping the whole Silmarillion and arguably all of Middle-earth. But at the same time, it's clear that the Lay of Leithian and the, quote, Silmarillion must have been understood as two distinct entities. So you can say that the Lay of Leithian, for instance, both is and is not part of the history of the Silmarillion. It's obviously related, but it's also just as obviously distinct. So after painstakingly reproducing a timeline of the relevant works laid out in Histories of Middle-earth, noting where they overlap and where some of them were misstated and later corrected, and where some of them were lost and later found, and also after desperately asking the Googles for help and finding a few quite lovely resources that I will link below regarding how one is to make sense of the structure of Histories of Middle-earth. This is how I am proposing to proceed, and I may, or let's be honest, most likely will have to make changes to this as I go. There's a very good chance that it's just completely off base. But for my starting point, as concerns the Silmarillion qua Silmarillion, that is the entity Tolkien conceived of as the sort of backbone of all the various diverse creative expressions that were set in his invented universe. I will be looking at the sketch of the mythology, the Quenta Noldorinwa, the relevant section of either the Annals of Valinor or the Annals of Beleriand, both the first and the second versions, where that distinction applies, the earliest Quenta Silmarillion, the relevant parts of the Annals of Aman or the Grey Annals, again as pertains to the section that we're on, the later Quenta Silmarillion Phase 1, and then, where applicable, the later Quenta Silmarillion Phase 2. I will, of course, make reference to either the Book of Lost Tales preceding all of that, or some of the final writings that came after that sort of evolutionary chain. The caveat here is that certain sections almost have to be treated separately. For example, the three great tales, you're also going to have to take into account the relevant verse forms, the more developed, almost novelistic late narratives. You're going to be paying much more attention in that case to Book of Lost Tales. This will also, of course, apply to things that are more visibly separated out, like, for example, the Ainulindalë. And I don't know what we're going to do when we get to the Numenor material, because that's a whole nother ballgame. But, we'll burn that ship when we come to it. I would be happy to rant in further detail about the unexpected complexities in the way all of these texts are laid out. But then again, maybe those comments will just sort of naturally find their way into the discussion at the relevant point. So thank you all for bearing with me thus far, not only in this particular installment of the series, but in the stalled series itself. I feel a little bit like Fingolfin, dusting myself off and trying to convince myself that it's worth mounting another assault, and Histories of Middle-earth is just this dark, ogre-like figure looming over me at this point. But like Fingolfin, I am frequently too stubborn for my own good, I guess, because I'm starting to feel the hype again. I will go blast some Blind Guardian, and I will stitch together a meaningful account of how this very strange book came to function the way that it does. So until our next meeting, farewell.